This is the Reading with Rochelle podcast, where we explore history we never learned in school but wish we had. I'm Rochelle Chase, an author and a columnist, and this week's book is Living the Legacy of African American Education, a Model for University and School Engagement, edited by Dr. Sheryl Croft, Dr. Tiffany D. Pogue, and Dr. Vanessa Siddle-Walker. DEI is being used as an excuse to get rid of race-based scholarships, to cut funding, to eliminate initiatives that encourage the hiring of qualified Black teachers, to ban books, to erase Black history, and much more. It's going to take all of us to change things for the better. Living the Legacy of African American Education, a Model for University and School Engagement, offers one possible solution, a program called Teaching in the Urban South, or TITUS. TITUS explored the basic premise that if the strategies used by Black educators during Jim Crow were successful in educating millions of students, then why not try some of these strategies today? Listen in as Dr. Sheryl Croft, co-editor of Living the Legacy of African American Education, a Model for University and School Engagement, shares how TITUS works, its results, and how educators can implement something similar today, plus what non-educators can do to help our students succeed. A little about Dr. Sheryl Croft. Dr. Croft is a native Atlantean educated during Jim Crow in the segregated South. She currently serves as Professor of Educational Leadership in the Bagwell College of Education of Kennesaw State University, coordinator of the Doctorate in Educational Leadership, and director of TITUS, a multi-state affiliation of scholars dedicated to providing and ensuring educational opportunities for marginalized students throughout the Southeast. As a veteran education practitioner with over 35 years of K-12 experience, she has served on every level of leadership, from classroom teacher to principal to director for high schools to assistant school superintendent. As a scholar, her work is informed by and lies at the intersectionality of informed practice and research that seeks to improve educational opportunities for students marginalized by systemic inequities. Okay, Dr. Croft, welcome to Reading with Rochelle.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I was looking forward to this conversation because when looking at your book, Living the Legacy of African American Education, a Model for University and School Engagement, what really appealed to me about this was the fact that it has some practical advice on what educators can do today. But before we jump into that part of it, what I wanted to kind of ask is, you're one of the co-editors of this book. It's you, Dr. Sheryl J. Croft, Tiffany D. Pogue, and Vanessa Siddle-Walker. And so how did this come about? I mean, what made you decide to do this book?
It started when a group of graduate students, along with Dr. Siddle-Walker, were studying the African American pedagogical model. In other words, how were Black teachers trained during segregation and Jim Crow? And that was based largely on Dr. Vanessa Siddle-Walker's work, Their Highest Potential. We were talking, we thought, what would it be like to try to replicate some of the professional development activities in which they engaged? And so we were all in her class, and we said, let's try it. Let's do it. And so in the book, we talk about how the faculty said, we don't have any resources. There's too much work involved. And the students, all grad students, said, no, we want to try it. And so with only a budget of about $1,000, we actually put on 2 conferences at schools in a major county, actually 3. And we brought together teachers, practitioners, and university professors, and they actually designed and trained professional development sessions for teachers. And so based on that, we've been doing that kind of work since then. It started in 2011.
And so you were doing the work before you wrote the book?
Yes. After we put on the conferences, we had Pedro Noguera as one of the guest speakers. We said, well, we need to document this to say that this can be done in a contemporary setting with urban students. And so we came together, and the chapters were written by the actual members of TITUS based on their expertise or either their interests.
And so the reason for this, I mean, what problems were you addressing with Black students and schools today? I mean, of course, now when we read on the news, you're always hearing the challenges, how some of the Black students, especially boys, I hear a lot about in math, not doing well, and then there's reading. And so at this time, what issues were you addressing at the time that you were doing this
When we were
work?
doing this work, one of the main issues that we addressed was raising test scores, the SAT test scores. And so fortunately, one of our TITUS members had worked in an SAT prep organization, and we were able to do workshops with the students, particularly with math and then language arts. And so that was one of the issues we were addressing. Another issue that we addressed, and let me just back up and say that everything that we did was based on what principals in the 6 schools that we targeted asked for. Another principal asked for us to work with him specifically on activities around Black History Month. Another principal asked that we work with them in terms of professional development for their teachers in language arts, in history, and then in math. So whatever the principals asked for in those particular schools, we tried to deliver the either services to the students or services to the teachers based on their ask.
So how did this work? So you mentioned TITUS, and that's what this program is. And you mentioned the African American pedagogical model. Can you explain what that model is and then what TITUS is?
I'll start with TITUS first. TITUS is teaching in the urban South, working with, we use the term marginalized students now, but mostly Black and brown students, right? And so the basic premise was that if the strategies of the African American pedagogical model worked during Jim Crow to educate millions of students, then why not try some of these strategies today? And so that was the kind of impetus for how TITUS got started and how we were trying to work. Okay, what is the African American pedagogical model? It is a model that talks about teachers and school leaders and how they led. I've been a principal, assistant principal, and district level superintendent. And so I've seen it from the time prior to No Child Left Behind and the way it is now. I am also a product of the dual system. And so when people, the dominant narrative that you hear about those schools is they were under-resourced. That's true. They were under-resourced. That they didn't have adequate supplies. That's true. They did not have adequate supplies. But what they did have were teachers who believed in the students. And I think this gets to, and you may talk about it at some time, Jim Crow's pink slip, teachers who were so prepared to teach the students. And to me, the key is that they were preparing students for a world that did not exist for them. So that students like me, I could go and I could compete on any level. And not just me, the kids who were in school with me. And so that's part of the model. High expectations, a firm belief that it doesn't matter where the student comes from, that we will educate these children. And that if you think about it, that's different from the way we think about school now. If children are not doing well, now I'm not saying that they're not problems. That's not what I'm saying. But if children are not doing well, the first thing most educators say is it's the parents' fault. It's the parents' fault. But in the African American pedagogical model, there was a symbiotic relationship between the parents and the school and the community. In other words, the parents sent the kids to school and they expected the school to educate their children. And in return, because of the lack of resources, parents supplied much of what the school needed. For example, if you had a construction worker and you need a playground, they would donate their time to build the playground, that kind of thing. And so that's just a snippet of what that model is. It's based on aspirational beliefs and resistant beliefs. Aspirational beliefs had to do with preparing the students, as I said, for the world that did not exist for them. That is, you had to be the best student that you could be. part of that mantra is that every day in every class, teachers would say, you're going to have to run harder. You're going to have to work harder because you're starting behind. But we're going to give you the tools to catch up. And I can't tell you, almost every teacher I had said the same kinds of things. And the preparation prepared us to go on and do things in society that, can I say it? Nobody, I can't say nobody. I will not make a blanket statement, but so few of the people who work with our children today believe that they can and that they will, and that despite all the odds, we're going to help you get where you need to go. They've almost, they have almost given up, and it's not because they don't want to. It's because of the system under which they have to work.
And what do you mean by that? A system under which they have to work?
I compare how they work now with children to the way my teachers work. When I was in school, we took tests twice a year. In the beginning of the year to see where you were, and then at the end of the year to see how much progress you have made. The children today take tests on a day. Well, daily is an exaggeration. They take tests regularly. They start off in the school year preparing for the test. That's what they hear day in, day out. Even some schools have countdowns to tests. 300 days to the test, 200 days to the test, that kind of thing. So that the test is uppermost on their mind rather than the learning. Lessons today in many schools, school districts are scripted. And teachers who go to learn the pedagogy, to learn how to engage students, to learn how to make education exciting, get very discouraged because they say, did not go to school to learn how to read a script. I already knew how to read a script. And if you're not on the same page at the same time, then you're criticized for it. I can't tell you how many innovative, creative teachers have left the profession because they are not teaching. I can give you one very poignant example. A coworker of mine taught ninth grade math, and his students performed at the 90th percentile. Overall, his school performed at the 49th percentile. And he was told, I need you to teach what everybody else is teaching and the same way. He was a math teacher. And he said, I can't do that because I'm teaching to the basement, if that makes any sense. He left the profession. So we're losing creative teachers because they are being handcuffed by a curriculum and by a mindset that if you score well on the test, you're learning. And that's just not how education works, in my opinion.
Did the TITUS program, does it address some of these things as well?
We wanted to address some of those things. We did in the professional learning when the math teachers and the professors were together, but we did that as graduate students. So now that we have all graduated and most of us are in the academy, we work individually in our various states with different groups. For example, we have some members who work with language arts in schools to do the same kind of thing. Let me see. One is an associate dean who does remedial work for students using the same kinds of things that TITUS is based on. So now that we've spread out, we haven't done anything. No, that's not true. Every summer we do a Juneteenth celebration and we bring parents and the community intergenerational groups together, but that's not specifically for the learning.
So let me understand. And when I read the book, I went through the different parts of the program, and it seemed like collaboration was key. You mentioned parents, teachers, principals, the universities. The university involvement, that was very key to driving this program. Can you kind of go over how this program works and how these various components of it collaborate and work together, and then what they're solving? Is it driven by what the schools say they need? It seems like it is based on your book, but if you could just talk a little bit about that.
So we realized that in today's culture, there is a disconnect between higher ed and K-12. And having come from K-12, I know that K-12 is very suspect of higher ed. And when I say suspect of higher ed, what I mean is that traditionally and now that I'm higher ed, we have done is gone into schools, mined them for their data, come back, published based on their data, and not necessarily giving anything back. No reciprocity, right? What do the schools get out of it? And so Titus as a group, we said, we have to be able to give back. We have to be able to make the connection. And one of the things that we understood is that we needed what we called in the book a boundary scanner. A boundary scanner is someone who is connected or has been connected in both worlds, and that they can bring the two worlds together. In this particular instance, I was a boundary scanner because I had worked in K-12 for many, many years. And then I was now in higher ed. My job was to introduce Dr. Siddle Walker to the principals. And if you ever talked to her, she said that was the most intimidating experience that she's had, because all she could think about was being in the principal's office and doing something wrong, right? And now this is the truth. They drilled her. They drilled her to see if she was authentic. And afterwards, they said to me, they said, look, she's the real deal. She really wants to help us. And had that not been the case, Titus would not exist today. And so we made the introductions, and we got the principals buy-in into what they needed. Now, you mentioned earlier about this thing about Black boys and putting them out of school and the discipline. The Titus Fellows, that's what we call the principals who worked with us. They were vetted. Not every principal, and I shouldn't say this properly, would have been able to be a Titus Fellow, but they were vetted because they had the characteristics of the principals during the Jim Crow. The principals, they had the characteristics of the African American pedagogical model. They believed in the students. They believed in the parents. They worked with the community. They were forward thinking in terms of the programs that they devised for their students. And they weren't overly disciplined. And when I say that, I mean, they didn't just throw students out to throw students out. They worked with students. So that's how we vetted those principals.
Okay. So you've got the principals who have been vetted for the program. You've got hopefully the trust by these principals for the people at the universities. So now how does this program then work? I know there's different meetings, there's conferences, but how does this program work to address the concerns that the principals may have or the educators may have?
So once we had our set of principals, there were 6 of them, and I mentioned that we asked them, what do you need? What do you need us to do? And so as a team of graduate students, we met, I think, every Monday, and we came up with a list of deliverables. And we said, this is what we can do based on your needs. This is where we have expertise based on your needs. And so after that, Titus members were assigned to specific schools, and they would go to the principals and actually meet with the principals to say, this is what we can do. When do you want us to get started, and how do you want us to get started? And so rather than it being a trickle down kind of thing, it was a grassroots kind of thing. So, totally dependent on what the principals needed us to do and the expertise that we had. And I guess the culmination of that, in addition to working in their individual schools, were the conferences that we had. We had 2 conferences, and every conference, well, I say 2, but 3. One was based at Emory, and then the other 2 conferences were school-based. And the principals allowed us to use their facilities, and that's when we had the professional development, because that was the purpose of living the legacy, actually seeing if we could replicate the professional development part of the African American pedagogical model.
Okay, so they're working, and you also had students at the schools involved as well, working with the schools also. So it wasn't just like faculty or people at the universities, also students at the universities, and then you had parents involved as well. And so what were the roles the others played? So the parents, what was their involvement, and then what was the involvement of the students at the university?
Students in the university actually delivered the services for the school. the parents helped to facilitate the meetings that we had at the school. And the parents were actually part of, we even had sessions for parents when we had the big conferences. And so we had one or two parents who were instrumental in advertising the events and getting the events and the information to the community. And so the principals would say, I have a community member that you need to talk to. We would talk to the community member and had to convince the community member that this was something worthwhile. And then the community member would help us get out the information, disseminate information. So even though it was just the professional development part, it modeled the collaboration between university, the school, the students, and the parents. And I guess the beautiful part about it is that this was student driven and everybody was working on their doctorate. And so this was in addition to all of the other stuff that we were doing, but we were so committed to it that we said, no, this is something we must do, at least in this particular time.
And that's amazing. I think you said in your book it was 2 years. You were working on this for 2 years and with pretty much no money and people doing this, like you said, in addition to, which kind of also is similar to the pedagogical model. It seems like it matched as well because they weren't dealing with a lot of resources either and people were doing other things as well, correct?
Exactly. We have an amazing colleague who I call him the procurement officer. But when we needed folders, when we needed pens, when we needed things printed, he would just go based on his relationship with other people. And the next thing you know, we have all the folders, all the pens, all of the things that we needed to make this happen. And I guess what I didn't say is that this model worked on trust and relationships. And that's one of the ways that I can contrast how we work today. There's very little trust between parents, between students, between teachers, even teachers and administrators. And this is just a quick anecdote. When I was a principal, I took leadership courses, right? So I got leadership certification, all like that. But what I did as a principal was based on what was modeled for me as a part of the African American pedagogical model. I didn't hear in school that if I have students who've never been recognized for anything, that it would be good to have a most improved student breakfast. I just knew that we recognize all students in my school. And to have a parent come up with tears in her eyes and say, my child has never been recognized for anything. Thank you for doing this. Or to have students who are late every day, right? And the first thing that would happen is that you want to send them home. I said, no. If we send them home, they can't learn. So I said, we're going to have Saturday school. They have to come up here and the parents have to come up here with them. And what did we have? Behavior modification workshops. And when the students had to sit through that and they talked to us, we said, why are you not coming to school on time? Why are you late? And we discovered from them what some of the problems were. And I guarantee you, after that, we had very little recidivism. The students start going to class on time and coming to school on time. And later, the head of student discipline in the district, he said, Sheryl, he said, I don't know what you're doing, but your discipline referrals have dropped significantly. It's because we put the student first, their needs first. And if you think about it, talk about the model. If you think about it, then the student was the center, right? Everything revolved around making sure the student moved up. And now it's kind of a reverse triangle. Teachers' evaluations, principal evaluations are based on how well the students do. So all of the pressure is on the students to do well. And I mean, you didn't ask me this, but I'm just going to throw this in. I can contrast this to private schools, right? And I am amazed that without saying it, private schools really have components of the African American pedagogical model that our schools that serve the majority of our students have pushed aside. That is amazing to me. And so you wonder why people want to gravitate toward that, because they see one institution that doesn't necessarily care about their students, right? Or at least that's the way it seems. And then you have another institution that seems as if it cares. And then there's some underlying things with that too. So why wouldn't you want your child in an environment where they love learning, where the teachers are not hamstringed by a scripted curriculum?
So you mentioned some of these things that you saw, some by these responses you got from students, from the educators, the feedback they gave you. What were some of the other results at the end of this? I mean, it seems like this program ended a little prematurely, I think you said, because Emory University and the department there had kind of dissolved, right? So that kind of ended this a little bit sooner than you would have probably planned to end it. But what kind of results did you see at the end of this, in addition to some of the examples that you just mentioned?
Well, with the school where we had the one-on-one SAT prep, the principal reported that his average scores for that group went up by 100 points. I'm trying to think any other specifics.
You mentioned history, I think, too. Was that one aspect of it?
The Black History program. We were just able to share historical markers with students who might not have known that before. So that was just a kind of enlightenment kind of thing that we did. But I think the most poignant example is the 100 points increase and the acceptances. I don't recall now what the acceptance was, but the fact that we were able to help them write their letters to college applications, I think. And you're right, it was premature in that the division closed. The division of educational studies closed. And then, like I said, we graduated. So we all went kind of our separate ways after that.
If teachers or communities wanted to implement something like this today, first of all, I guess it doesn't sound like the challenges, the problems that we're having have changed very much in the time, which is not a good thing when you look at, you're talking about 2011 and here we are today and it's the same. And in some ways it seems like it's gotten worse. That's me. I guess I should ask you, do you feel like things have gotten worse for students as to the time has gone by, or do you see areas where it is better for Black youth in schools?
If I'm honest, I would say there are pockets, few and far between, and those pockets exist where you have school leaders who are legacies of the African American pedagogical model. Does that make sense? And because that happened so long ago, and because there's so few educators who even know about it, then the leaders who espouse those principles of the African American pedagogical model, now I'm talking about current leaders, they espouse them and they work with them, the principles, because they've seen somebody else do it, not because they experienced it themselves. And so I don't think things are better. I really don't. And the more entrenched we become in the system that we have now, and like I say, I'll just go and tell the truth. It's designed to dumb children down. It's not designed to raise them up. It's the basement in terms of standards. And we think, oh, they did well on the test, but what is the test teaching to begin with? And so children are bored. Children don't like school. And then the other piece of it is that we treat children in so many schools as if they're prisoners. You know about the school to prison pipeline. They as early as kindergarten, they have silent lunch where they can't say anything. They march in lines. If a child is neurodivergent or a Black boy, for example, you cannot expect a Black boy to sit like a soldier. You have to have the strategies to teach them But when the curriculum is fighting against your knowledge, your pedagogy, what you know to do to be the right thing for students, then you're going to have discipline problems, right? I can't tell you how many of my students, I do a career equity audit in my class, in my urban education class.
You mean now?
Mm-hmm. And I say, I want you to look at the community. I want you to look at the teachers who are teaching the advanced classes. I want you to look at the resources available to your students in your community. And I said, I want you to look at the discipline. And it is eye-opening to them every time they do it. Who is disciplined? Black boys and Black girls. And if you had asked them before the equity audit, they'd say, oh, it's everybody. Everybody gets the same. Everybody's equal. But then when they see that, they say, oh, what's happening here? And so based on working with the students, my doc students, working with my students in the urban education class, it hasn't improved at all. And what's frightening to me is that the more entrenched they become in this accountability culture, the less likely they are to accept that there is a different way of doing things. And I hear so often, oh, we're going to talk about the emotional well-being of children. We're going to make space for conversation. We're going to do this. All of these little pieces, but it's all in one model. If people knew about the model. When I have graduate students who have gone through baccalaureate, master's, and sometimes a specialist degree, and now they're on their terminal degree, and they've never read anything about what we're talking about today, that's concerning.
That's a problem. Okay, well, don't let me forget to go back to the question about how to implement this today. I want to go back to a couple things you touched upon. You mentioned Jim Crow's pink slip, and that's how I actually got to hear about you and meet you now. Jim Crow's Pink Slip, The Untold Story of Black Principal and Teacher Leadership by Dr. Leslie T. Fenwick. And when I read that book, first of all, I say this on every book I read. I didn't know about this, but the fact that you had, as a unintentional and unplanned and unwanted byproduct of Brown versus Board, you have all of these Black teachers being and principals being pretty much fired rather than giving them roles in these new integrated schools. And now you're going and you're hiring all these white teachers that are not qualified. And then in 1970, they're doing these Senate, or 71, the Senate hearings that are proving that these Black teachers and principals were discriminated against and that they were better qualified. They had advanced degrees. They were highly educated, and yet and still they were not allowed to teach. And the fact that there were 100,000, I think, of these, this loss. And then you have these kids going into these hostile white schools where they're not wanted. And of course, they're not going to be taught any of this pedagogical methodology. All that's lost. And so I can't help but think about the ramifications of that. We're dealing with that today, that loss. And it seems like these problems that you're mentioning when you talk about Black children, Black boys, Black girls being in these schools where that's not being taught, to me, that seems like a direct correlation to that loss. Is that not the case?
You are spot on with that. I count myself so lucky to have grown up and have had the kinds of teachers that Leslie Fenwick describes. See, here's the piece. Leslie Fenwick talks about how well trained they were in most northern schools, northwestern schools, all of those schools. But the key to it is that when they came back, they were actually part of the professional network that we talk about in Living the Legacy. That their training, they got the formal training outside. But when they came back to figure out how do you work with these children, they had the network of professionals and they met on a regular basis. I remember we would be out of school for half a day so that the teachers could go to these meetings wherever they were. And so I'm in Atlanta. And so after desegregation in Atlanta proper, which is a whole different story about how they did, They had so many Black students concentrated in Atlanta proper because of white flight, 80% at one time, that they could not bus the students, the Black students, the way they did in some of the outlying areas. So then what did they do? The great compromise in Atlanta was that they would desegregate, integrate the faculty. And so those who didn't get fired, most of them were moved to other schools. But white, every time an opening came available, they'd hire a white teacher who had low expectations, who didn't think the students could do well, who half taught. So that by the time I went back to my high school to teach, I was appalled at the difference, because what I saw and experienced as a student was no longer the standard. It was very, very, very disheartening.
Can you, for those who might not be aware, can you talk a little bit about what those differences were? So let's talk about your experience, and then when you went back, what you saw. Can you share that?
As a student, the teachers engaged in differentiated instruction. They had books, believe it or not, as old as they were, that had A, B, C problems for the math. So that the teacher, if the teacher knew you were going to struggle, you'd have the A problems. If the teacher thought that you could do the harder problems, you got the C problems. This is when I was a student. We did things, we had expectations of excellence in everything we did. Christmas, we'd have a full Christmas concert, orchestra, band, the chorus, and at the end we would do an Alleluia chorus for everybody. You would think that you were at the symphony orchestra with the quality of it. When I came back, the school was immaculate. It was clean. It was orderly. Nobody was telling you walk in line. You just did it because you were proud to be a member of that school, right? When I came back, it was dirty. Children were running all over everywhere. Teachers were watching children run all over everywhere. Not all of them, but enough of them just didn't care. I worked with one colleague who was right next door to me, and she'd sit and read the newspaper and write something on the board and tell the children, be quiet, just do the work, instead of engaging them. It was terrible, and it was disheartening. And so my students would say to me, why do you want to make us work so hard? I said, because you can, and because you're going to do it. And one of the things I said, look, you have to work harder to fail my class than to pass it. To pass it, you have to do the work and do it with excellence. Some Black teachers were telling the children that, those who remain, but the other teachers were not telling them that. These children can't do. And I know that's not true. So that's one of the stark differences.
Okay, well, that's a good segue then into how one can implement, if one wanted to read your book and implement the TITUS program, how would they go about doing that today?
There has to be a concerted effort to work with the university that's close to you. One of the things that we're charged with is partnerships, right? I would suggest that if someone were interested in this, that they could reach out to any member of TITUS, and we would be happy to work with them to start a kind of partnership, to work along with them. And I think it's going to take small groups of interested people, starting small and engaging in the model. But see, the first thing is, if they don't know anything about the model, how are they going to engage with it? So it's going to have to be people who are interested enough to say, I need to know more about this. And then talk to those of us who do know it and read it. And I know that sounds so, ugh. It's not a good answer, right? But that's the only answer that I have right now, because there are not enough people who know about the model to be able to integrate it in with teachers who care.
Is there anything else you want to add that I may have missed?
Only that how we educate children is critical. And what we're doing now is not working. And whether people want to admit it or not, there is a way to educate children that does work. We just don't know about it. And not enough people know about it. And if anybody would ever say, let's look into this, let's find out what we're not doing and address it, I think we could turn this.
Do you think, given, the climate today and what we see happening with this new administration, it feels like it is taking us even further backwards. Do you feel like the advice that you are giving is any different given the challenges that we may be facing in the next, like from now to the next few years? Who knows what those are going to be, but I'm just saying it's not looking good at the moment.
You're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, some colleagues and I wrote an article entitled "For Us, This Is Not New." And what we were saying in that article is that as Black people, we've been here before. And if we will look at our history, things like the African American pedagogical model, there is an answer for how we have to navigate. Now, there is one difference, and the primary difference is that during the time that Jim Crow, the powers that be didn't care about our schools. They didn't care what we did, as long as children weren't running all over the place. Now, the powers are entrenched in our schools. So what we're going to have to do is find ways to educate our children outside of school. It may be summer camps, right? It may be church kinds of things, right? The way the Saturday schools that other people have. We're going to have to buckle down, but we're going to have to first learn again how to educate our children. This model is crucial for where we are today. We just don't have enough people who know about it. And the book, Living the Legacy, is only about the professional development part of it. There's a whole leadership component. Pre-Brown African American school leadership. There's a whole leadership component. There's a whole teaching component. And we've got to find some way to get it, to find those who want to know.
Yeah, I think again, it takes time and effort, right? It's if you don't know what that model is, meaning I'm not an educator, but when I read certain books, like when I read Carter G. Woodson's book about his methodology, his history book that he wrote, when I read his writings, I start to see what this is. That also just kind of gives like an overview of like the teachers, the act of rebellion teaching was, and some of the things that you're talking about, how it was this sense of community coming together because education was so important and everybody has a stake in this and everybody is working together on this because it's so important. My point is, it's like, even if people could just start reading some of these books to kind of get this understanding, and then looking at books like yours, African American Education, a model for university and school engagement, and other books, and figuring out, okay, how do we really implement this? It seems doable. It just seems like it's going to take work, just like everything else.
It is doable, and it absolutely will take work. And I'll say this, and then I'll be quiet, that there's a reason that the schools that serve predominantly Black and brown children have to be scripted, because they need a workforce. They need a dumbed down workforce. And the reason there's an attack on education is that education was the key for us to move out. And if they take that away, then they have a group of people who don't think critically, who don't think for themselves, and who just, they hope will just be a dumb workforce, right? So that's why we have the attack on schools. If you don't know who you are, then you think that this is the best you can be. And you don't have anybody telling you, no, you can be better than this. And that's what this model, the African American pedagogical model, does. It says, no, you are better and you can be better.
Well, thank you, Dr. Croft. I think that's a great place to end, although I feel like we could keep talking. This is very interesting. We could keep going. But I do like, again, the advice you've given, the practical things people can do. And I like also the things you mentioned about it's going to take work outside of schools. That's something we can all do. People who aren't educators, people who, just care about our children and making sure they can be everything that they can be. I really think there's a spot for all of us in this work. Thank you so much for being on Reading with Rochelle. It was great chatting with you today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. I appreciate being here.